Their primary mission is to save America from national bankruptcy and to preserve the American dream by educating, motivating, uniting, and most importantly, empowering we the people. Does that sound familiar? With the knowledge on how to take back our country one state at a time by using the tools cited in the U.S. Constitution. Lauren J. Ennis is co-founder and national director of IamAmerican.org, as well as co-founder of the BBA Task Force. In addition, he is the author of The Sword of Liberty, an action novel in which he chronicles the knowledge of our founding fathers and the Constitution's Article 5 Convention. This is the same Constitution amendment process which Mark Levin has written about in his new book, The Liberty Amendments, in which he calls on the states to use this powerful mechanism to reform the federal government. Lou B. Marin, is it Marin or Marin?
Just Typhoon Lou's fine.
AKA Typhoon Lou, there you go. Is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of IamAmerican.org and Fair Tax Patriots, as well as the co-founder of the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force. His recent success as a political activist is attributed to a wide spectrum of experiences, from that of a highly decorated United States Navy Chief Petty Officer and Gulf War 22-year veteran to that of a world-class magician. How about that? He also served as Florida's co-state director for Herman Cain's 2012 presidential campaign and is a grassroots expert, motivator, and a huge Article 5 advocate, leading the charge for a balanced budget amendment for America. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Lauren and Lou a big warm welcome to center stage.
Appreciate that. Where I come from, we say aloha.
Aloha.
I think I heard, what, 3 or 4 people, Lord? What do you think?
Maybe 2.
We'll give them one more time, one more shot at this. In Hawaii, we're a lot louder than that. I want the folks to hear us in D.C. Aloha.
Aloha. I don't need no mic. Aloha means hello, goodbye, and I love you. And I'll tell you, I love patriots. Folks that get out and want to learn about the Constitution. I'm going to ask you 3 questions right now, and I want you to think about that as we present this to you. Number 1, do you support the Constitution in its entirety?
Yeah.
Number 2, do you want the political elite to be in charge of the checkbook, or would you rather be in charge of the checkbook? And number 3, what is history going to write about you? So, having said that, when we started here, I got excited to see what happened in this last midterm election. That lasted about 2 hours. And I started thinking, what the heck's going on? Been there, done that. Deja vu, as they say. You know what I'm saying? I started looking at the landscape. Go, wow, we got 8 new senators. Took over the, actually 9 now. Took over the Senate, which is really helpful in what we're doing. We got a few more congressmen in the House.
New one today.
Another one today, that's right. Got net 10 more governors. Over 3,200 state legislators, which I just addressed in Washington, D.C. here last weekend. And of course, 63 new chambers. I got excited. Then I realized, whoa, we've been here and done that before. And I started to do some research. I think Edwin Burke said it. He said that those who don't know their history is destined to repeat it. And I started thinking about that. And I started getting chills, started getting worried about it. And I started, you know what? Let's compare. Let's compare Bush with Obama. And I was blown away when I started doing some footwork, some notes. Bush and Obama. Bush and Obama, both medical expansion. Remember that?
Yeah.
Bush, bailout. Obama, stimulus. They both signed off on the Patriot Act. They both lost the House under their watch. The Gallup poll blew me away in the first term. Both equal, the same 49%. I looked this up. This is the reality. I about fell over. You're talking about hardcore conservative. And the one that scares you, you know what, Alan, is that last one. Under the 8-year tenure, Bush spent $5 trillion, and Obama's going over 8 here in a few days. Now, I don't know about you. Ask the question, do 2 wrongs make a right?
No.
Which is the lesser evil?
Neither.
I started thinking, what is going on? We have to act fast. Rome is burning, ladies and gentlemen. We are going broke, if not already broke. We are in such severe trouble right now. Our country's at peril right now. You ever thought about what happens if our country goes bankrupt? Number one, Social Security's not going to come in no more. Number two, disability's not going to happen. Number three, military retirees, federal retirees, kiss that check goodbye. Number four, the biggest welfare recipients, the biggest of pull them all, 50 million people. You're talking 110 million people on the streets looking for food and shelter. That scares me. And these folks like to spend money to stay in power. And to me, I don't know about you, but that's not what I grew up to believe, being fiscally responsible. These guys are out of control. They have an addiction to spending. It's like a drug. And we have to stop it right here, right now. You're going to learn how to do that tonight. Also kind of blown away too, and I think about this. How come Congress has less than a 10% approval rating and we keep electing them back to office? This is nuts. I think we all got to get our head examined sometimes. This is crazy. And again, those who not, again, George Santana said the same thing pretty much. Those who don't know their history were condemned to repeat it. So, how can we reform Washington? We know it's broke. And unfortunately, we're outgunned, we're out-resourced. We cannot compete against the special interests. I'm not saying give up. I'm going to fight like right next to you. You try to elect better people. But I'm telling you right now, we are outgunned and out-resourced. However, we have an advantage. We have the states. We have boots on the ground. We can take them down pretty easy through the states. How are we going to do that? We're going to ratify 3 amendments. It's easy to remember as ABC. A, we're going to abolish the IRS and replace the tax code. Amen. It's the #1 killer in America for jobs. We're literally taxing people out of the country, out of business. We got a 40% corporate rate. They're leaving the country in droves. And these people up in D.C., oh, they're evil corporations. That's how out of touch they are. Case in point, Burger King moved across to Canada. Just unemployed folks down in Miami. Sad state of affair, but they employed a lot of folks down there. Moved to Canada. They're paying only 18-19%. They're fed up. You know the irony of this thing? It's a Brazilian-owned company. You didn't know that, did you? Blew me away. Another case in point, Microsoft. Microsoft. My brother used to work for him. He just quit recently, by the way. It didn't do with security. His fault. He spent working with almost 18 years. He just quit. He said, I'm fed up. He said, I'm tired of putting unrealistic projects on me. 7 months to do a 1.5 year project. He can't do it no more. He's fed up, especially when they cut their budget in half. But he said, what scares me, he said, they're laying off 18,000 folks in the Great Northwest. Why? Because for every American they can lay off, they can hire 3 folks from India. Again, the corporate rate. I want you to connect the dots. Very important. Why it's important that we get rid of this tax code. It's arcane. It's got to go. B, balance the federal budget. I live in a budget. You live in a budget. 49 out of 50 states have a budget. Why can't D.C. get that? You with me?
Oh, yeah.
Are you all for that?
Yeah. Did you say 49 states have balance?
49 out of 50 states have a balanced budget.
Which one does not?
I can't remember who it is. No, not California, actually. It's
Just the ones that.
it's some East Coast one. I can't remember. I never remember that. But anyway, we'll get to ask questions later. C, compel our government to follow the Constitution. The Founding Fathers wrote it for them. Stay in the lines of the Constitution. All right? Let's take A, for example, now. Let's talk about A. How many here just love our tax code? Raise your hand. I'm in the right room. Good. How many are flat tax people in here? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Flat.
Flat.
How many are fair? You know, I asked a question. I'm going to compare the difference. I want to show you the difference. It's very important you understand this. Our tax code right now is over 80,000 pages long. Stands over 12 feet tall. Does that seem green friendly to you? That's nuts. That's crazy. 80,000 pages. You might have trees to cut down. That's not green to me. Well, let's say that to my folks on the left. H.R. 1040 is also known as the flat tax. H.R. 25 or S13, also known as the fair tax. Let's compare them. Option 1, 80,000 pages. Americans waste hundreds of billions a year trying to comply to the tax code. Politicians use the tax code to reward their special interest cronies, punish their opponents, and discourage productivity, investment, savings, while encouraging illegal activity, the underground economy, and of course, illegal immigrants. H.R. 1040, also known as the Flat Tax or the Freedom Flat Tax Act. I love how they title stuff. Sounds so good, don't it? Yeah. I'm going to show you when you look a little deeper what it is, first of all. 17 pages long. It's a lot smaller than, of course, the current tax code. But it's an alternative to our tax code. Special interests wrote it to fool you, just like Obamacare. You with me? It's alternative. You can pick either the tax code or you can pick flat tax. It does not get rid of the tax code. It does not get rid of IRS. You with me? Very important you identify that. Taxpayers do not get, they get to choose which one they want. They go over the flat tax system, but again, like I said, it does not abolish IRS. Of course, it has no sponsors. They had a couple and they lost them. So I think they heard my presentation. They said no more. Again, the fair tax, H.R. 25 S13. It's approximately 131 pages long. Again, it's green friendly. Okay, about a quarter inch or maybe half inch thick. It totally replaces our tax code and abolishes the IRS. Now, full disclosure, it really doesn't abolish it. It'll knock down 80% of what it is today, and the other 20% will be renamed, and they'll be collecting the taxes through the states. Okay, I want you to understand that. But it's transparent. It's a national consumption tax. Everybody pays their fair share. I love saying it on the left. You got to pay your fair share. No. Yes. The fair tax plan is about wealth creation, expanding opportunity, economic growth, rewarding businesses and investors which take the risk. Currently, we have over 70 folks right now in D.C. that are sponsoring it. It's going to take 281 congressmen and senators to pass it. That's a big mountain to climb, ladies and gentlemen. We have an alternative. We have a plan B for you. Again, I want to reemphasize a couple things real quick. The flat tax does not replace the tax code. Just give you a choice. Does not abolish IRS. Does not create jobs. It requires you to disclose all your personal information. The fair tax is based off behavior of consumption. Think about that. You're looking at about approximately 11 million people in the underground that gets to pay their fair share. I get excited about that, raising money so we can replace that few trust accounts that need some replacement real quick here because we're in trouble. Abolishes IRS, eliminates abuse of power. You keep 100% of your paycheck. I like that. They make us mad. We don't spend nothing. They make no money. You're in charge now, right? Kind of like that. We the people. It creates millions of jobs. We know 68% of the people said if you guys go to the consumption tax, which wipes out all the federal taxes, they said, we'll come back to America. What will that create? Jobs. Millions of jobs. It breaks our heart. Laura and I go across the country teaching this, and mom and pops are out there going, my voice don't count no more. They're frustrated. They don't know what to do. We show them this, they get excited. They show them this, how to get it done, and they get really excited. They said, our kids are going to college, getting degrees, master's degrees, and they're coming home because there's no jobs out there, living in the basement. It breaks my heart. Again, broadens the tax base because it includes legal and illegal visitors as well as the underground economy. It's private, anonymous, unless you own a business, they'll track you down to get their state money for the federal folks. And again, no more stressing April 15th. Everybody pays their fair share. You with me? Very important. Even Ronald Reagan hated the tax code. He even said our federal tax system is, in short, utterly impossible, utterly unjust, and completely counterproductive. It reeks with injustice and is fundamentally un-American. You agree with that? Yeah. I'm telling you, man, the guy had it going on. Again, at the A, the B, balance the federal budget. Our country is $18 trillion in debt. We are in trouble. These folks go rob business. Oh, just print some more, don't print some more. And remember, when the country starts printing their own money, that's the last The last sight of a dying country. It's the last thing of a dying country, so beware of that. So tonight, you're going to learn three things. The history of the Article 5, the Founding Fathers, what is it intended for? It's in the Constitution. Number 2, you're going to learn the process, how it works. And number 3, we're going to eliminate all the myths that are out there. There's a whole bunch out there, probably getting by the left. So at this time, I'm going to bring up my compadre, Lauren Ennis. He'll be teaching. Big hand for Lauren, please.
Okay, let's see if I can get this thing fired up. The first question I always ask, oh, here's your last slide, Lou.
Oh, which one was that one?
Oh, that was just a balance budget.
Oh, okay.
All right, so how many of you are happy with the way Washington is governing right now? Anybody? Okay. How about the reverse? How many are unhappy with the way Washington is governing? I would join you right along there. Well, we're here to talk about reforming the federal government by unleashing the Constitution's greatest power. Our founding fathers knew a day like this would come. They knew eventually the federal government that they established in 1787 would turn on the American people. They didn't know how soon, they didn't know when, they didn't know in what situation. But they ultimately wanted to give the states power over the government that the states were establishing for their own safety and prosperity should that government turn on the states. America is at a paradigm-shifting crossroads. We have reached that point that our founding fathers feared that we would reach, and why they gave the states ultimate power over the federal government. We've reached the point at which we may need to use that power, and we have to decide whether to stand idly by and watch as the president and Congress destroy our country economically through the borrowing that Lou was talking about. $18 trillion, that's equivalent to $153,000 per taxpayer. Or if you want to make it, if you want to divide it by every citizen, that's $53,000 per citizen. You all know those, all those immigrants that they're now supposedly going to make legal? Guess what they're going to say? Welcome to America, and here's your share of that $18 trillion debt. $53,000 hung around their necks the moment they're made citizens. And that's both legal and illegally coming to this country. The illegals, of course, being made legal through an act of the tyrant there. Now, what about newborn children? The moment they breathe free air, oh, welcome, you will become an American citizen when you're 18, but the moment that you come out of the womb, you are $53,000 in debt as an American or a future American citizen. It's sad what we've done to future generations. And where the federal government has gotten this money from is just inexcusable. They've taken it from everything they possibly could. The Social Security Trust Fund, the Medicare Trust Fund, Military Retirement Trust Fund, over $5 trillion of that $18 trillion debt has been, quote, borrowed from those trust funds that were supposed to be there for all of us, you, a lot sooner than myself. My generation, we've given up. We're so sarcastic about Social Security and Medicare. If you're in Generation X, you know long ago you kissed that goodbye. We know we're being charged for it and we're paying in. We know we're never going to get anything back. Well, that trust fund that was paid into by yourselves, your entire lives, $2.7 trillion, gone. That's how much we took in total in taxes last year, has been raided from the Social Security Trust Fund alone, and it's completely gone. Raided by our congressmen and our senators and our presidents, 20 years. So we can sit by and allow that to continue happening, or we can pick up the mantle that Ronald Reagan laid down in 1989, 25 years ago, when he left office. Ronald Reagan was the greatest proponent of the balanced budget amendment tax replacement campaign through the states. He tried to get it done through Congress, and Congress actually did. The U.S. Senate actually proposed a balanced budget amendment in 1982. I don't know if you remember Tip O'Neill. When it got to his controlled House, they just torpedoed it. So Reagan tried to get that through Congress multiple times and never succeeded. He also started the campaign through the states to propose and ratify a balanced budget amendment, which is what we are working on today. They got very close, but ultimately they didn't get to the 34 states required. So what we've done within the last 2 years is pick up that mantle that Reagan laid down, the one major accomplishment that when he left office remained unaccomplished. And we want to carry it through to the finish line so we can prevent national bankruptcy and save the American dream. Now, to understand our constitutional power to do that, to pick up that mantle that Reagan carried along the way, we have to understand our founding fathers. They came from a generation that was forced to revolt against British tyranny because they had no representation in Parliament. You may recall, of course, it was the taxation issue. Well, if you go back to the Magna Carta, one of the main complaints of the British people at that point was that the king would just levy taxes on them, and they had no right to dispute that or to debate it. So as a part of the Magna Carta, the British people were given the right to dispute and debate taxes that the king wanted to levy upon them through their representation in Parliament. And so when the king, King George III, in the late 1760s, to pay for the French-Indian War, decided to levy all of these new taxes on the colonists says, hey, wait a minute. You're trying to tax us, yet you're not giving us some way to dispute it through representation in Parliament. And that went on from 1765, the stamp tax, all the way up to 1773 with the tea tax. And after 8 years, the colonists, well, actually, no, that would have been 2 more years before things got real serious. But the colonists finally had it. They said, look, you cannot legally tax us as citizens of the crown without giving us representation in Parliament. And ultimately, it led to war. Now, this forged our founders' belief that the people must be able to check federal power, either the people or the states. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson reflected that belief when he wrote, if a government becomes self-destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Though our founding fathers had to deal with a king 3,000 miles away, they had no way to represent their own interests in Parliament, and ultimately had to revolt. And they knew that if they won, and they established a new government in its place, a new national or federal government, they wanted to make sure that the states, as those that originally fought the revolution, those that gave their blood, sweat, and tears, could ultimately bypass and reform this government. And this was a reflection of that belief, that they were not going to cede ultimate authority to a new government without giving the states and the people some way to reform it. Now, given the impossibility of granting that power directly to the people, I mean, you think of the city-states of Greece, like Athens, where democracy was first founded. It was easy for the citizenry to come to a central amphitheater and to vote on legislation directly. But obviously, in the colonies where you had 1,000 miles of coastline, from Maine down to Georgia, that was impossible. So it was impossible to grant that power directly to the people, so they granted it to the states. Our founders established 2 state checks on federal power, checks that their own states didn't have on royal power or the power of Parliament, which again is what led to the revolution. So to avoid that in the future, our founders wanted to make sure the states had ultimate power over the federal government. In 1787, the first state check they granted was in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And that established the states' right to appoint their U.S. senators. You may recall originally, of course, that was the states were supposed to be represented in the U.S. Senate. That's why no matter whether you're talking about the smallest state in Rhode Island and Delaware versus Virginia or New York, every single state had 2 senators. And today, of course, that gives Wyoming as much say as California or New York or Texas. And originally, of course, the state legislatures were the ones who appointed both of those U.S. senators. Can you imagine how much more responsive to the desires of the state that those U.S. senators would be when they were actually appointed by the state legislature? Lou and I were talking to the president of the Arizona Senate, and we were talking about this issue, and he said, you know how many times John McCain has come down to visit us in the state legislature? He's supposed to be the representative of the people of Arizona and the legislature of Arizona. Not one time. You know why he didn't? Because he never had to.
As a representative of the national government.
That was the first power. Now, our founders intended that to be the everyday state check on federal power that could be exercised. Think about the powers of the U.S. Senate that are unique that the House does not have. First of all, you've got federal legislation, of course. That's the one you think of first. Who ultimately approves Supreme Court justices?
Yeah.
The Senate. Who ultimately approves presidential cabinet nominees? Attorney General, Secretary of State. Yeah, can you think of who are currently serving in those positions?
Yeah.
You think Eric Holder would have ever been elected if the states had retained that power? Not likely. So we've got Supreme Court justices. How about treaties? So you've got those 4 huge powers granted to the U.S. Senate. And when the states held control over their 2 U.S. senators, the states effectively had power to determine federal legislation up or down. Supreme Court justices, treaties, and of course presidential cabinet nominees. Just think about that power, and if we still had that today, would we have Obamacare? If you have 30 Republican-controlled state legislatures, and they can send directives to their US senators telling them how to vote, would we have this national debt? Of course not. And you all know what stripped the states of that power, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. To prove that our founders intended for the states to exercise that power on a daily basis if necessary, we go to James Madison, who confirmed that sentiment when he wrote Federalist 62, the definitive treatise on the Constitution. He said the state's right to appoint U.S. senators will guard, and I quote, against improper acts of federal legislation. No law or resolution can now be passed without the concurrence of a majority of the states. Just think about the implications of that. Our founders intended for the states to have a check on everything passing through Congress through their control of the U.S. Senate. And that was, of course, usurped with the 17th Amendment almost a little over 100 years ago. And no wonder why we're in such a bad state as a nation. For 100 years, the federal government has run roughshod. Once you send your congressmen and senators, as much as we love them individually, to D.C., we rate them collectively at less than 10%. And that's always puzzling. You have John Pike re-elected locally here with 62% of the vote. That's over where Lou and I live. I'm not sure who the, oh, that's nice. How about we not restart in 10 minutes?
That's not good.
Yeah, apparently, it decided. Yeah, it's not on in the cards.
Yeah, we'll just do midnight.
Yeah. You guys up for it? Midnight? So, no less than the father of the United States Constitution reiterated that fact in the Federalist Papers when the states were debating whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And they wanted to reassure the citizens of these 13 separate states that were very loosely governed under the Articles of Confederation. Hey, if you ratify this new Constitution, your state legislators, your direct representatives will have power over one branch of the federal government or one chamber in Congress. Now, if that wasn't enough, if you have a problem that was much greater than the day-to-day operation of the U.S. Senate, our founding fathers gave the states a second check on federal power. And this is the most grand of all, and it has never been used in American history. And that was granted in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. It gave the states the exclusive power to both propose and ratify amendments to the U.S. Constitution. If you think of the greatest power granted under the Constitution, that's it, right there. Was that granted to Congress? Was it granted to the President, the Supreme Court? No. It was reserved for the states because who was it that revolted against Britain? Who was it that shed the blood of her sons and daughters? It were the states. It was the states. And our founders were determined that if we were going to accept a new federal government, that ultimately we were not be forced to go through the same thing that our founders went through when they had no power to debate and object to the taxes being levied upon them. If that were ever to happen again, if this new federal government were ever to become abusive or to go beyond the scope of its power, it would have the authority, the states would have the authority to bypass and reform. That gives the states absolute power over the federal government. If the states wanted to, they could abolish the presidency. Bye-bye. Congress, goodbye. Supreme Court. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that that's the power.
Sounds good.
All in favor?
Well, you read the Federalist Papers, that was
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Now, and here's another Federalist paper. Federalist, written by Alexander Hamilton. In Federalist 85, Hamilton confirmed the exact sentiment by saying, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against encroachments of the national authority. Right there, he was talking about what the states had gone through under King George III. Parliament and King George had encroached upon the right of the states and their citizens by forcing taxes on them without giving them any way to dispute or debate them. And so this was the mechanism, ultimately. If the previous mechanism through the control of the U.S. Senate failed, this is what we can use to bypass and reform Washington. Think about term limits. How many people in here are in favor of term limits? How is that ever going to happen? Do you think Congress will ever propose that amendment? No. So if you want term limits, this is it. That's the only other way. The states have to do it. All right, so how does this process work? There's a number of steps that we have to go through. First of all, 2/3 of the states must apply for a convention on the same topic. Now, in theory, you could apply for a wide open convention, but that will never fly. It's been tried. No state legislator is going to look at that and say, oh yeah, let's call a convention and everything's on the table. State legislators are not stupid. Lou and I got an application through the Florida legislature last year for a balanced budget amendment, and that's it. That's all that can be discussed. And Florida established laws dictating the penalties for any delegate sent to that convention representing Florida that would provide a method for their recall if they tried to go off the reservation, discuss any other issue. And if they did, they'd be immediately yanked out, replaced. They would then be prosecuted for violating their oath to the state of Florida. So this is not a joke. If and when we get to 34 states and the Florida legislature sends a delegation, these will be very well qualified people who will have very definitive limits placed on what they can do. And if they were for some reason to go, off their rockers and decide to, try to discuss something else, they will be immediately withdrawn and penalized. All right, so once we get to 2/3 of the states applying for a convention on the same topic, in our case, a balanced budget amendment, or maybe a fair tax amendment, then Congress must call the convention. This is purely a formality. Congress is the one entity that says, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, they count up 34 state applications. Once you've reached 34, then Congress sets the time and the place. The third step, the amendment is then written and officially proposed by the convention delegations. And the most important part is that it's one vote per state. And that's what you see throughout this process. It takes 34 states to call for the convention. Wyoming's call is powerful as California's call. Within the convention itself, you will need a bare majority to pass the amendment or to approve it officially. So you're talking 25 states. Republicans now control 30 states. So who will control the convention? The Republican Party. And it will be one vote per state. All right, so once we've written the amendment itself and we've approved it with 26 states voting, and again, the Republicans will easily come up with that block, the amendment is then officially proposed by the states. Now, isn't that sad? Congress could do this within 2 weeks. It just goes through the House and the Senate, done. With the states, this takes years. Do you think Congress is ever going to propose a balanced budget amendment to tie its own hands, to give up the national visa? Of course not. That's why we have to go through this laborious process. All right, so it goes back to Congress where they select the mode of ratification, purely a formality. They can either choose ratification by the state legislatures or special state ratification conventions. Now, the ratification convention is the one that people are always interested in. When they say state legislatures that they have for 26 of our 27 amendments, that's straightforward. We all know the state legislature pretty well. But what about these ratification conventions? There's actually a law in the state of Florida that dictates if that ever happens, if Congress ever specifies by state convention, we have one representative for every one of the 67 counties in Florida. So you will have a special election held within each county where the people running for that office, which is a very limited office, what are they going to be doing? Voting yes or no on a balanced budget amendment, to ratify or to not. And that's simply what they'll run on. They'll run on a platform saying, I will vote for it or I will not vote for it. That's it. And then the convention will be held in Tallahassee, and you'd have 67 delegates voting on whether to ratify or not ratify the amendment. And that allows we, the people of the state of Florida, to determine the state's vote. And that was our founders' intent, is that the state conventions would be based upon the election of delegates directly from the people. All right, so no matter which one of those votes Congress selects for ratification, the final step, of course, is 3/4 must ratify. That's 38 states. And that is the ultimate safeguard that our founders wisely put in place. You think about 38 states. Even the Republicans controlling way more state legislatures than Democrats. We have 30. So if we're going to get something through this process, it has to be something that's very widely supported. A balanced budget amendment rates even higher than term limits. It's so common sense. You get people from across the spectrum. I mean, people from lower income neighborhoods to the richest guy living up on the hill. It's just balancing your checkbook. And you can talk about individual states being irresponsible, What happens when the federal government is irresponsible with its checkbook? I don't care how good the economy of Florida or Texas is. If the federal government goes bankrupt, we all go with it. All right, so 3/4 of the states have to ratify. Now let's take a look at the relationship between the 10th Amendment and Article 5. How many 10th Amendment fans here? Oh, yes. All right, but have you ever actually read through it and then thought about the lack of teeth in the 10th Amendment? I mean, it says something great. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, once again, that sounds nice. It establishes the boundary between the federal government and the states, how much authority the federal government has. But what if the federal government were to violate the 10th Amendment and go across that boundary? Is there any mechanism to push back?
They've done it many times.
Okay, but my question is, how do we push back? Is there any mechanism in that amendment that says, okay, if the federal government violates the spirit of the 10th Amendment, this is how you resolve the situation? No, they didn't. Well, remember, this was a part of the Bill of Rights. This came after the Constitution. They didn't have to put any teeth in it because there already were. Article 5. The states already had the power to enforce the 10th Amendment by calling a convention and proposing and ratifying amendments that would push the federal government back across that boundary. Now, is Article 5 the only way to enforce the 10th Amendment? No. You have nullification, which is a defensive mechanism. Many states are passing nullifying laws to get rid of Obamacare. I believe South Carolina has done that recently, and a couple of other states are thinking about it. So it can be used for good purposes, but what about Colorado? They nullified federal pot laws, and so now pot is legal in the state of Colorado. Now, so it can be used for good or bad, but ultimately, the one Achilles heel of nullification is the federal courts. Right now, Pam Bondi is trying to get them to delay. One federal judge just ruled that Florida's protection of marriage law is unconstitutional.
Right.
One judge usurping the will of 20 million Floridians. Does that seem right? Of course not. And that's the only problem with state laws, including nullification laws. A lowly federal judge, unelected, can just simply overturn it. And then the ultimate example of that is Roe v. Wade. In one fell swoop, Jane Roe was only disputing the Texas law. Well, the Supreme Court took that as license to just say, well, we're going to strike down Texas's anti-abortion law, and then all 49 others. They just created a brand new right out of thin air. So ultimately, if the federal courts want to, they can strike down any state law, including nullification laws. Well, Article 5 is an offensive weapon, and this allows you to completely bypass and reform the federal government. Amendments to the U.S. Constitution are set in stone. Now, those are the rules by which 3 branches of government must govern. So we're not talking about state law, we're talking amendments to the Constitution with as much force as the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and every other part of the Constitution. All right. Now, why is it that we are in such a bad state? I mean, we've talked about the powers that the states have to push back. If the people that we elect to Congress and to the U.S. Senate ultimately betray us, something weird happens to them, they go to D.C., and we'd all like to know what it is. Is it the water? You know, people who will sit there and talk about these high-minded ideals and how they're going to be the one to resist the lobbyists and the temptations of D.C., and then what happens to them? Individually, we elect them at 60, 65%, and then collectively, once they get to D.C., we rate them at less than 10. Just think about that concept. Well, why is D.C. out of control? Because the states haven't used their constitutional checks on federal power. One of them has been gone for 100 years, per the 17th Amendment, and one of them has simply never been used. So no wonder we're in such bad shape. If ultimately our representatives in D.C. go astray, then there were those 2 mechanisms the state legislatures had to bring it back on the right path. And of course, the 17th Amendment, as we all know, got rid of the ability of the state legislatures to appoint their U.S. senators and control their votes. I was testifying before a committee in the Florida House, and I was talking about this. And I don't think it truly registered on those legislators until I said, imagining dictating the votes of Marco Rubio and Bill Nelson. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, these guys are like, oh yeah, this is not just theory. If we still had that power, we could dictate their votes. And then he said, I'd like to talk to you after this. How was it that we lost that right? And I'm sitting there thinking, man, you don't know your history. Because by the looks of all of you, you already know that the 17th Amendment rules. The 16th and the 17th probably being the worst of all time. So how can we solve the problem? Well, we've simply got to use the constitutional power that our founding fathers gave us to ratify a fair tax amendment, and of course, a balanced budget amendment as well. Before we do that, however, we must be comfortable with the process. Obviously, with such a powerful weapon, there have been many who have attacked it. That it is the greatest fear of the DC establishment that the states rediscover the power they had under the Constitution and still have. All right, so let's talk about the myth of the Runaway Convention. And this is more of a historical view. I'll talk about the specifics of it and how it's just simply not true, but knowing the historical context and where it got started is really illuminating and allowing you to judge it for what it's worth. The myth of the Runaway Convention originated when liberals attacked the Article 5 Convention. And it had to do with 3 controversial Supreme Court decisions from the 1960s and 1970s. If you had to characterize that court, would you call it liberal activist from the 50s, 60s, and 70s?
Yeah.
There were a number of very controversial decisions. The 3 decisions that prompted the states to use Article 5, or to start using Article 5, were, of course, the ruling on prayer in schools, the state apportionment of legislative districts, where the Supreme Court tried to tell the states how they were to form the legislative boundaries of their House and Senate districts, which got the states up in arms. It was U.S. Senator Everett Dirksen who actually launched the Article 5 campaign to have that Supreme Court decision reversed. And then, of course, ultimately, the biggest one of all, 1973, Roe versus Wade. In response to those 3 abhorrent leftist court decisions, the states at that point, there was no attack on the Article 5 Convention at that point. It was just seen as the ultimate resort for the states. Well, you think that DC was going to sit idly by and watch as the states bypass the federal government and use this mechanism to reverse those 3? No way. The far left attacked these campaigns to protect their church. They were horrified that the states would actually, for the first time in history, use this mechanism. Because again, how many of you would like to see Roe versus Wade reversed? How is that ever going to happen? Do you think the Supreme Court will reverse itself? They tried 10 years ago. Norma McCorvey, the original Jane Roe, asked them to rehear it. So we know that's not going to happen. You think Congress is going to propose an amendment to reverse it? They've had 40 years. So it will be through the states. The states are the only way that Roe versus Wade will ever be reversed. Now, the ultimate attack was, of course, launched by Warren Burger, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1969 to 1986. He attacked the Article 5 Convention and claimed that it would run away and rewrite the Constitution and do all sorts of crazy stuff. Well, let's examine Warren Burger's background and his possible motivations. As I said, he was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon in 1979. Guess who allowed Roe v. Wade to be heard? Warren Burger. Out of the 10,000 cases that came before the Supreme Court to be heard, about 150 of them are granted a hearing per year. Out of 10,000, Warren Burger took that one and allowed it to be heard. And then guess who voted in favor of it? It was a 7-2 decision, Warren Burger. So if you were to identify the father of abortion in modern day America, it's Warren Burger. He allowed it to be heard, and he voted in favor of it. So go figure. In 1983, I believe it was, he wrote a letter when the states were very well along in an Article 5 campaign to reverse Roe v. Wade. There were actually 16 states that had called for an Article 5 convention to propose an amendment to reverse Roe v. Wade. And that's when Burger responded by writing a letter. And unfortunately, if you hear people talking about that letter, do they tell you about this part? Do they tell you that it was in response to 3 different state campaigns to reverse these 3 abhorrent court decisions that Burger and other Supreme Court justices like Arthur Goldberg is another one that's commonly cited? Did they tell you about the fact that the states were trying to reverse 3 Supreme Court decisions, and that's why these Supreme Court justices attacked it? Go figure that out. Now, if we move along to the 1970s, and once again, liberals attacked Article 5 because Ronald Reagan, no less, as governor of California, looked at the spending of the federal government and said, you know what? Congress will never limit its own ability to spend and to borrow. The states are going to have to do this. And he became a part of a campaign sponsored by the National Taxpayers Union, the NTU, which I believe Grover Norquist was actually the head of the NTU at that point. And Ronald Reagan, along with Grover Norquist and I believe, was it Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, those three were the ones that launched an Article 5 campaign in the mid-1970s to propose an amendment, to propose a balanced budget amendment. So, of course, liberals couldn't sit back and allow that to happen. No less than Walter Mondale was tasked with leading the sabotage campaign. That's when the states actually got to 26 states out of the 34, with Reagan leading the charge. And all of a sudden, a lot of times what the states do out in the hinterland doesn't get the attention of DC. And all of a sudden, the liberal establishment said, whoa, where did this come from? 26 states have called for a convention. They're only 8 states away. So no less than the Vice President of the United States of America was tasked with doing a stealth attack on the campaign. And ultimately, they sabotaged it. I'd love to throw that back up there because you remember that election? That's where Ronald Reagan got a little bit of sweet revenge. It was Walter Mondale who sabotaged his efforts. He was no longer governor of California, and his greatest issue that he worked on in the mid-70s as he ran for president in 76 and then 80 was this campaign. And ultimately, Mondale sabotaged it. And then in 1984, well, I think you all remember, Ronald Reagan got his sweet revenge at that point. Walter Mondale in the late 1970s formed a group called Citizens to Protect the Constitution, which was the biggest joke. This was a group of far-left organizations, I mean the who's who of the far left. The NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, every public employees union that you could think of. I mean, it was an amalgamation of groups that would seem to have no common connection except they were far left. What problem would they have with a balanced budget amendment? Well, that would prevent liberal politicians from promising their constituents or potential constituents the moon. And then how do you think they're going to pay for all of the promises they made? Borrowing money. This was the greatest fear of the far left. You take away the national visa from Congress, and you take away their power to pay back their constituents. And ultimately, they were successful. They took the campaign that was launched back in the 1960s. The runaway convention myth was conjured up by liberals in the 1960s, and then it was reused in the 1970s to sabotage, once again, an Article 5 campaign from the states, in this case, a balanced budget. Now, let's talk about it. Now that you know the history behind it and where it came from, now let's talk about the actual conspiracy theory itself. So, of course, that would be the number one, most well-known runaway convention. Alarmists, and when I say alarmists, I'm talking about the far left. They're the ones that originally launched this. Have suggested that delegates could go rogue and rewrite the Constitution because Congress cannot control the state delegates. Okay, do you want Congress controlling these state delegations? Of course
That would be a negative.
that's ludicrous. If our founders had given Congress control over those delegates, you have to check their mental capacity. The whole purpose of this convention is so that the states can bypass Congress. There's no way that our founders would have ever given them control. So what do we know about all power not granted to the federal government? Per the 10th Amendment, it is granted to the states. So that myth is absolutely false. Just because Congress can't control them doesn't mean they can't be controlled. The states control them. You know how many conventions our founders held in the colonial era? Over 20 of them. This was old hat to them. They held conventions on everything from Indian affairs to economic affairs to war planning. How about the Continental Congress, 1774, 1775? Those were conventions called to talk about how they were going to respond to the taxation of the British. They were old hands at this. They didn't figure it was a big deal. You know, the states call a convention for a specific, in this case, amendment, and they send their delegates, and here's how the states control the delegates. The state applications can limit the debate to one topic. If you were to read the one that Lou and I got through the Florida legislature last year, it is specifically limited to a balanced budget amendment. No other amendment can be discussed by the delegates that are commissioned by the state legislature. And they passed a Delegate Limitation Act to go along with it, establishing the method by which the delegates are selected, the limits of their authority, an oath they have to swear. These are like ambassadors that you're sending to a national meeting to represent the state. What if an ambassador went to negotiate a treaty and then just decided unilaterally, oh, hey, I'm going to negotiate this other treaty? that I didn't have power to. They bring back that new treaty, and the people that sent them would look at them and go, what were you doing? We didn't give you the power to do that. That's exactly what these delegates are going to be limited by. And beyond that, there are penalties that can be applied. You're talking about a felony. So you come back from the convention having tried to talk about an amendment that wasn't authorized, you were immediately yanked out, publicly embarrassed. This will be historic. This will be the greatest political event in 100 years. For the first time in history, the state's rebelling against DC. And you think some delegate is going to risk national humiliation and prosecution and potentially being thrown in jail just to bring up some amendment topic that no one else will buy into? So state delegates can be kept on a tight leash by the legislature, and of course, under Florida law, it is a felony to discuss any other topic than the one authorized in the original application. All right, so let's